All right, welcome to game 12. This is the last sequencing game we're going to do, and definitely the hardest sequencing game we're going to do. You'll see in the upper right, this is drawn from the December 2011 LSAT PrepTest 65. It's the fourth game. It's the last game on the logic game section of the test. After this lesson, we'll do some grouping games, and then a couple of games that have a combination of grouping elements and sequencing elements. And then the last two games are really unusual. As you can imagine, the creators of the LSAT have realized that, there are certain patterns here that people can get used to who study a lot of games. And of course, they don't want to make the test easy. So they've come up with lots of unique games. And the best way to prepare for them is to learn the fundamentals that we're going over in this series of 20 lessons. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at the game. And if you don't have a copy of it, just take a look at our website and you'll see the link to the book, the group of prep tests that the creators of the test, the LSAC, has published. It's volume 5. And after you've taken all these logic games lessons and then done a bunch of practice problems on your own, this is a game you want to get to a point where you can do a game like this. And we said 13 to 14 minutes. So clearly more difficult than your average game. All right, let's take a look here. We're scheduling 5 TV programs. And this gets a little tricky. We're told that one of them is an hour long, and that is G. And then the other 4 are a half hour long, and those are R, S, T, and W. R, S, T, and W. And the first showing will be at 1 p.m. and the 5 shows in total will occupy 3 hours of TV time. Okay, so what are the rules? Rule 1, G starts on the hour, not the half hour. G on, we'll say on the hour. Rule 2, T starts on the half hour. T on the, I'll just write half hour. Okay, how about rule 3? R before S. So finally a simple rule that we're used to. And then rule 4, if W is shown earlier than T, then it is shown immediately before T. So how do we want to write this? So if W is before T, then what? Then it's going to be W right next to T. Now, if that's true, what else is true? Well, if T comes before W, W doesn't necessarily have to come right next to T on the right-hand side. The rule doesn't say that. It could come at any point after T. So we have 2 options here. If W is before T, it comes right before T. If W comes after T, could be immediately after or could be a few slots over. So why don't we just cross out the original part, sort of confusing things. We just know we have 2 options, WT or, and I'll just write or here, T followed at some point by W. All right, how about combining our rules? Well, let's see. The only item that is discussed in 2 rules is T. So T has to be on the half hour, which means what? If W comes immediately before it, obviously goes without saying that W starts on the hour. On the other hand, if W comes after T, W could start on the hour, could start on the half hour. All right, so just get a sense of things. And that's about it. Really no way to combine the rules. So now we're ready to draw our diagrams. And as we've said many times, if you can break this up into 2 or 3 broad scenarios, you absolutely want to do that in here. Hey, I mean, G starts on the hour, a perfect candidate here. So let's draw 3 diagrams. And, this game is really tricky. Let's make that the first hour. Let's make that the second hour. Let's make that the third hour. Okay. And so let's see. So we have 1 o'clock and we have 1:30. And why don't I just say 2 o'clock and 2:30. Don't want to take up too much space. 3 o'clock, 3:30. And then my items will appear beneath those time slots. Now let's look at the rules again. G is an hour-long program. It differs from the other programs in that it is an hour long. So let's find a way to represent that. I'm going to draw a big box around G. And in our diagram, how about we have, so G could either start on the hour, looking at rule 1, could start on the hour, could start at 1. And here I'll draw another diagram over here. And you can see how important it is to try to write carefully, write neatly, because this can be a real mess if you don't. So we got 1, 1:30, 2, 2:30, 3, 3:30. And yes, this takes time, but we will have a real problem answering the questions if we don't have a good diagram. All right, so option 1, world 1, you can have G starting at 1 p.m. you could have G starting at 2 p.m. and then we'll write another one down here that has G starting at 3 p.m. G starting at 3 p.m. and that's an hour slot. And since this is drawn right underneath the scenario 2, I'm not sure that we need to write 1, 1:30, 2, 2:30, etc. We can see what's going on. Now, here's the kicker. Although we've written 6 slots here, there are only 5 TV shows. So really in scenario 1, G is the first show, but whatever appears at 2 o'clock, well, that's the second show. And then these are half hours. So the third show, the fourth show, the fifth show. Look at scenario 2. First show begins at 1, second show at 1:30. Now G is the third show in this case. So the fourth show at 3, the fifth show at 3:30. And then in our third scenario, and why don't I call this scenario number 3, at 1 o'clock our first show, then second, then third, then fourth, and G is fifth. So I make it look like it's really simple. Of course, it's not at all. And you can imagine having to do a few reads on this game just to understand what the rules are all about and what the diagram would look like. Not an easy game. And I think one lesson that's worth repeating is that, you want to diagram the games somewhat slowly and write out the rules, interpret the rules pretty slowly to make sure that you're off to a great start. Then the questions become a lot easier. All right, so that's rule 1. We created our 3 scenarios based on rule 1. How about rule 2? T is on the half hour. So in my first scenario, so T, it's either at 3:30 or it's at 2:30. All right, scenario 2, T is, again, could be at 3:30 or it could be at 1:30. And then finally in scenario 3, T, it could be at what is 2:30 or it could be at 1:30. Rule 3, R before S. All right, well, that one, thankfully not a difficult one. R before S, R at some point before S, R at some point before S. Rule 4, W either appears immediately to the left of T or it appears at some point to the right of T. Not necessarily immediately to the right, but at some point to the right. Well, let's see how that's going to look. All right, so suppose T were at 2:30, scenario 1. W could appear at 2, or it could appear at either 3 or 3:30. All right. How about if T were at 3:30, though? W would have to appear at 3 o'clock. Could not appear before 3 o'clock, would have to be at 3 o'clock. So clearly we've spent a significant amount of time thinking through all this. The more games you do, the more quickly you'll be able to think through these kinds of things. Now we're in a much better position to take on the questions. Okay, question 17, typical acceptable situation question. And let me underline our master diagrams here. We don't want to tamper with them. Okay, so what do we always do? Take one rule, try to eliminate an answer choice, go to the next rule, try to eliminate an answer choice. From time to time, you will see a game in which one or two of the rules are a lot more complicated than the others. In here, rules 1 and 2, unlike any rule we've seen before. Rule 4, similar to rules we've seen before, but not quite the same. So when we start eliminating answer choices, why don't we take the easiest rule? In this case, rule 3, R comes before S. Let's do that one first. So rule 2, R before S. So A is fine, B is fine, C is fine, D is fine, but E violates that rule. So we're going to cross out E. So which rule do we want to apply next? Well, all 3 remaining rules, a little strange. So I'm thinking rule 4 is maybe the easiest to apply. So if W is before T, it's right before T. And if not, it could come at some point after T. So let's see. How about A? Is W before T? Yes. And it's right before T, so that's fine. How about B? W right before T, that's fine. How about C? Now, some people might get tripped up on this. They might say W came after T. It's supposed to come before, so we cross this out, right? Well, no. If W comes after T, that's fine. So C is okay. But D, W appears before T, but not right before it, so D is out. All right, rules 1 and 2. Now, rule 1, G starts on the hour. So I look at my diagram. So that means G is either the first show or the third show or the fifth show. So let's take a look. A, G is the first show. That's fine. B, G is the fifth show. It's the last show, so that's fine. C, G is the fourth show. That can't be true, so C is out. All right, last rule. T starts on the half hour. Be aware that G starts on the hour. So A, for example, all right, so G would start at 1 o'clock, and then R would be at 2, W would be at 2:30, T would be at 3. All right, there's the problem. T has to start on the half hour, so A is out. B, let's just take a look to make sure everything's okay. So G, we have that as the 5th show, so it would start at 3 o'clock. T would be starting at what? At 2:30. That's fine, so answer B. That's about as long as it's ever taken us to answer the first question, the acceptable situation question. But at least the good news is we've had a chance to verify that, yes, we got the rules right. We understand the rules, so we're in pretty good shape now as we look at the other questions. Okay, first question, question 18. And I will say, the one nice thing about this game is that we now have a chance to get 7 questions right, to get 7 points, rather than just 5 or 6. And of the 7 questions, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them give us some details. We like questions that give us some details, really narrows down the possibilities. Question 18, let's go to a new slide here. If Waterloo is shown first, then how many orders are there in which the remaining programs can be shown? And of course, I don't have a lot of room here, so anytime I need to write something out, I'll write it in the middle. And another thing I want to mention, starting with PrepTest 66, the creators of the test give you a lot more room on which to write out a logic game. So you have much more room than you see on any of the prep tests that we'll be doing in these 20 series. And then starting in July of 2019, when the test becomes a computer test, they're going to offer you, just for the logic games, a few sheets of paper on which you can write out your diagram. So that's actually a big help, starting in July 2019. And as I may have mentioned in an earlier lesson, in June 2019, that will be the last test on which everybody takes the test on paper. In July 2019, if you sign up for the test, you will not know when you sign up whether you're going to be taking it on a computer or whether you're going to be taking it on paper. You'll find out when you show up on the test day. But regardless, starting with PrepTest 66, you have a lot more room to write out than you used to. Okay, so if Waterloo is the first show, what do we have here? Well, we're not in scenario 1. We're in scenarios 2 or 3. So why don't I mark those? And I'm writing in the middle here. So in scenario 2, we have this. And let's just start with that. So if W is first, look at our WT rule. And since the rule that talks about W is not written in the diagram, I'm going to go and circle rule 4. So we'll make a point of coming back to look at that from time to time. If W is first, what does the rule say? T has to come right next to W. If T precedes W, it has to come right next to W. Okay. And then what happens after that? Well, in World 2, we have G taking up the entire hour from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And then what? According to our rule, R has to come before S. So in scenario 2, only one possible arrangement, and that was scenario 2. How about scenario 3? How about scenario 3? Really, essentially the same story, and we have G on the hour at the end. If W is first, has to come right next to T, R, S follows that. So the answer to the question, 2, answer B. Question 19, if R is second, each of the following could be true except. So 4 of these choices could be true. One of them cannot be true. This one, pretty straightforward. If you look at our diagrams, you'll see what is possible and what is not possible. Just pause for a moment and take a look. The one thing that is not possible, answer D. Waterloo cannot be in third. Question 20, if S is third, then which of the following must be true? Must be true means must be true in all scenarios. All scenarios in which S is third. So let's see. I'm not sure we even have to write anything down here. How about A? If S is third, so if S were at 2:30, must it be true that G comes first? Well, in scenario 1, if S were third, who comes at 2 o'clock? The rule says S has to be preceded by R, so R would be at 2 o'clock. And then after that, WT, so that's fine. In scenario 2, S can't be third. G is third. How about scenario, if S is third, has to be preceded by R, so R is either the first show or the second show. Now, where does T go? If T were fourth, it has to be preceded immediately by W. So T couldn't be fourth, but could T be second? Yes, if T were second, W can appear. We look at rule 4. W can appear to the right of T. So W could be fourth, R could be first. So this one may be a little tricky. G could be the first program, but doesn't have to be the first program. Could be the third program in scenario 3. So A, not a must be true. How about B? If S is third, must it be true that R is first? Well, that one's easy to get rid of. We just look at scenario 1. When S is third, R has to be 2. R can't be 1. So we can cross out B, and I should have said we can cross out A as well. How about C? Must it be true that R is second? Well, in scenario 1, we had R as second, but how about scenario 3? we said earlier that if S were the third, the shows that precede it would have to be R and then T. So C is out. So E better work. Must W be fourth? Yes. In both scenario 1 and in scenario 3, W was fourth. So answer E on that one. Question 21. If G is third, then which of the following could be true? Well, this one should be pretty easy because G is third. That narrows us down to scenario 2. Why don't you pause for a moment and take a look at this one? We know the rules pretty well at this point, so I don't think I need to go through all of them. Answer C. Answer C on question 21. All right, 22. And normally in a general question like this that doesn't give us any details, I skip that one and come back to it. But here, question 23 is actually the hardest question on the game, maybe even the hardest question on the test. The rule replacement question, which I've said before, appears once on every LSAT. One of the 4 games now has a rule replacement question. So we'll actually take on question 22 right now. Question 22, new slide. Which of the following cannot be true? How about A, S shown immediately before G? Well, yeah, that can be true. That can be true in scenarios 2 and 3. How about B, W shown immediately before R? Now, why don't you pause and take a look at that one, see if it would work or not. W immediately before R. Well, first of all, of course, if W immediately before R, that means it's not immediately before T, which means what? It has to go to the right of T, which in scenario 1 would put it at 3 o'clock on the hour. But then what? S would be shown at 2 o'clock. S would be preceding R, and the rule says it has to come after R. And if you take a look at scenarios 2 and 3, we're going to have that very problem in scenarios 2 and 3 as well. So answer choice B on this question. All right, last but definitely not least, the infamous rule replacement question, question 23. Now, we've talked about rule replacement questions before, and the way to handle them is to do this. Take the rule, which in this case is what? G has to start on the hour, which is really a must-be-true rule. G must start on the hour. It must start at 1 or 2 or 3. You have a rule, and then you have to come up with an alternative rule that has exactly the same effect on the game, meaning what? Meaning that all of the arrangements that are now allowed will still be allowed, and all the arrangements that are now prohibited will still be prohibited. All right, well, how do you handle that? Take the rule, in this case, G must be on the hour, and ask yourself, that is the same as saying what? What is an alternative rule that is the same as saying G must be on the hour? And just think about that for a moment. Take a look at the 5 choices and see what you come up with. And remember, you're usually going to have 2 or more choices that seem like a close call. So you do want to look at all 5 of them. But think about if G must be on the hour, that is the same as saying what? Then look at the 5 choices, and then we'll come back and take a look. All right, hopefully you got rid of 3 of these right away. Hopefully you got rid of B, D, and E right away. And if you still weren't certain of the right answer, hopefully it would have been A or C. Take a look at them again. The answer is C, but why is A wrong? Think about that for a moment, and then we'll come back. Here's the problem with A, and to some of you this may have been obvious, to some perhaps not, but let me write this underneath scenario 3. So scenario 3, for example, T has to be on the half hour. So to say that G not immediately before T says what? Well, you probably look at that and you say, all right, well, that means G has to be on the hour. But here's the thing. Suppose T were second, and I'll cross out the other T. Well, if G appeared after T, and rule A doesn't rule out that possibility, if G appeared after T, well, suppose G appeared on the half hour, started at 2:30, ended at 3:30. Could all the other rules still apply? Sure. R comes before S, and W, well, it comes either before T or after T. Either way will be fine. So, for example, we could have WT and then RS. We could even have, and maybe I'll write this over to the left where I have some more room. So here again, suppose we had T was second. Suppose G started on the half hour. We could have R come before T because if W follows T, it can go anywhere. So we could have, really, this slot could be S or W. This slot could be S or W. So A, not the correct answer. Whereas C, our original rule was G has to start on the hour. That's a must be true. That is the same as saying what? G cannot start on the half hour. Answer C, you look at the 3 scenarios. Well, scenario 1, G is on the hour, so that doesn't change. Scenario 2, G can't start at 1:30. Same impact as the rule we have. Scenario 3, G can't start at 1:30 or 2:30. Same impact as the rule we have. So answer C. Let's jump to the top 5 list. Top 5 tips for law school interviews. Now, a couple of points about this. First of all, at the time of this recording in 2019, very few law schools require interviews. That may be changing, however. A second point, regardless of whether you conduct an interview or not, the things you think about in preparation for an interview are the same kinds of things you should be thinking about as you prepare to write your personal statement, and also the same kinds of things you should be thinking about as you prepare your resume. So as I've said before, writing a resume is really a process you should go through over a course of several months. Creating a personal statement, thinking about what you want to write, a process you should go through over several months. So as you do those two things, contemplate the possibility of an interview as well. Now, an interview for law school, it may be required. Few schools require it, but some do. An interview, it's also something you may request, maybe not necessarily a formal interview, but if you're visiting a campus and you want to speak with somebody on the admissions committee, it's very likely that someone on the committee will be happy to meet with you. And although it's not a formal interview, the meeting is, for all practical purposes, an interview, and you should treat it as such. It's also true that some schools may request an interview of you. If you are, for example, someone who's, let's say, in the middle group, you're not a presumed admit or a presumed deny. If you're in the middle, if it's kind of a close call, the school may want to talk to you. If the school has any concerns for any reason about your application, that's another reason they might want to conduct an interview with you. Could be over the phone, could be online, over Skype, for example. So there is a possibility you'll be conducting some sort of law school interview at some point. And if you're someone who has, let's say, a unique background, it might be to your advantage to request an interview. Suppose, for example, you're 30 years old and you spent 8 years in the U.S. Armed Forces and you were stationed in the Middle East. Well, if you're a pretty good interviewer, it may absolutely be to your advantage to actually talk with an admissions officer face-to-face. Suppose in the 2 years since you got out of college, you worked at, let's say, an art gallery, and admissions officers are wondering, why in the world would you want to go to law school? Well, of course, you're going to have to write a pretty persuasive personal statement. It may also be to your advantage to talk with someone in an interview. So there is the possibility of an interview out there, and so for that reason, it's a good thing to think about. Now, if you just conduct a simple Google search, you'll find any number of suggestions about how to handle a law school interview. Here we just want to give you a top 5 list. Top 5 big things to think about. Number 1, although there are a great variety of questions you may be asked in an interview, here are 3 big ones that you should absolutely be prepared to answer. Number 1, why do you want to go to law school? Number 2, why this particular law school? Why this one? And number 3, why now? If you're somebody who is now in college and wants to go to law school right after you graduate, why not spend a couple of years in the working world and think more about what you want your career to be? On the flip side, if you're out of college, one question you can expect is, well, why do you want to switch careers? And depending on what you do for a living, that may be an easy question to answer. That may be a hard question to answer. But either way, it's a question you can expect to get. Point 2, have anecdotes. What do I mean by that? Well, the more formal the interview, the easier it is for the interviewer to forget about it. Formal interviews are pretty boring, both for the interviewer and for the person being interviewed. If, however, you come in with some points you want to convey, the interview is going to be much more memorable if you have some stories to support the point you want to make. If you have some sort of story from your life, some sort of story about an experience you've had, your interview will be much more memorable, and presuming it was a good story, will be much more helpful for you. Point 3, come prepared with 3 questions to ask the person who interviews you. Usually at the end of the interview, that's when someone will ask you, do you have any questions for me? Well, 2 potential benefits here. 1, suppose you ask questions about details about the school, questions that are specific to that law school. Well, that conveys to the interviewer the notion that you are interested in not just in law school, but in their school, and they love to hear that. Second, the very fact that you have a few questions conveys to the interviewer that you came prepared. And whether it's a law school interview or an interview in the workplace, there's always a distinction between those who came prepared with some questions and those who did not. And you look much better if you came prepared with some questions. Number 4, and most of the people watching this video have probably never had a formal interview before, probably college students who have never had a formal interview, certainly not for a full-time job. Whether you have or not, it makes a lot of sense to conduct 1 or 2 mock interviews with whoever it may be, your school's law school advisor, someone in the school's career office. You definitely want to go through 1 or 2 rounds of a mock interview to help you prepare for the formal interview. And finally, before your interview, it's a very good idea to talk with somebody who attended that law school. And there are a number of ways you can find somebody. First, if you look at your own college alumni directory, oftentimes folks will list where they went to graduate school. That's one way. Second, if you just ask your law school advisor, that person may have a list of lots of people who went to your school who went on to law school and are more than happy to talk with you about the law school. A third way to find people is just to ask friends from school if they know people who went to a certain law school. A fourth way is to get on LinkedIn. That's an easy way to find people. So lots of ways to do that, but you'll want to talk to an alum before you have an interview. So that's the top 5. If you have any comments, it would be great if you share them. If you found the video helpful, please click the like button, share it with your friends. Be sure to subscribe. In the next video, we will take on our first grouping game. So hope you'll join us for that.